Heather Cox Richardson, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm so grateful.
It's always a pleasure, Katie.
Well, thanks. Let's start off with what has happened this week. So much. It's been nonstop. And I'm curious, Heather, how do you keep up with all of this?
Well, I have to laugh. You say what happened this week, and I instantly went into panic mode going, this week. How many things have already happened this week? And as we're recording this, it's only Wednesday. So there's a lot we could cover. But the answer to how I'm keeping up with it is I'm at it all the time. People send me material all the time. But the truth is, we can't cover everything. We can't keep it all in our heads at once, in part because the whole idea is to flood the zone, as they say, to overwhelm us. So I do the best I can, but it's not comprehensive. It can't be.
I talked with Ann Applebaum yesterday, who's sort of an expert on burgeoning and thriving autocracies. And she said flooding the zone or at muzzle velocity, as Steve Bannon has said, is fairly typical to autocratic leaders. Is that your experience as well?
Well, not my experience because I've never lived under one. And she, of course, is a fabulous foreign affairs person who does have experience in a number of different countries. But certainly, in terms of the way we think about the rise of authoritarianism, absolutely. The idea is to create such confusion and such insecurity among the people that they don't really know what's going on and they don't really understand what's going on. And there's two ways to answer that. You either say, it's too much, I can't deal with it, they're all alike, and you go back to doing whatever you do in your small area so that you don't pay attention to the larger political situation, you back away from it. Or you simply say, it's too confusing, there's too much going on, we need a strong man who will take care of these things. And in either case, you've opened up the way for an authoritarian.
It's also really challenging for journalists, isn't it?
You know, yes, I think it is terribly challenging for journalists. And I always like to point out, and I would love to hear what you have to say about this, that journalism is a really dangerous and demanding profession. And that's it, that would be your experience, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's time consuming, it's expensive, it requires experience, it requires expertise, it requires editors. It takes a village to actually put together an accurate news story.
Well, and it seems to me, I was not trained as a journalist and I am not a journalist, but it seems to me that what journalists are trying to do is to make sure that people have access to the things that are happening in the world around them as quickly as they possibly can. And what that means is that they're not always able to give the longer tempered view of why something is or is not important. Whereas somebody like me, I am not a journalist. I'm a historian trying to identify the ways in which societies change. So in a way, for me, it's a little bit easier because I can see something and say, that really doesn't matter that much. Or that matters a lot, but it's not my area of expertise, like the Super Bowl halftime show that happened over the weekend. That was clearly extraordinarily important. It was a cultural touchstone moment, but it's not my field. So it's much harder for me to comment on that. And right now, I look at journalists and I feel like many of them are trying desperately to tell people everything that's happening at every moment. But a lot of them are missing the larger picture, which is the rise of authoritarianism in the United States and the collapse of a certain kind of international order that has been in place since World War II, and that is hugely important to the American people. But there's such a background to that, it's going to be very hard for people to see it when they are covering, for example, Pete Hegseth's talk today about the future that the current administration sees for Ukraine. There's a whole dissertation in that alone.
Right. You're so right. And I think that's why I'm so grateful you're able to give us context, not only historical context, but context in terms of precedent and the way government is supposed to work. And I think that journalists are trying to keep up. So, and I think that's part of the strategy by the administration is to give us so much that we don't have a chance to say, wait a minute. For example, I have a friend who's a White House correspondent, and I want to text her and say, can you go back and ask her to ask, can you go back and ask the president why he believes the plane crash in the Potomac was caused by DEI? He never explained it. Is that because there was a female pilot in the helicopter. So things happen so fast. It's almost as if we can't slow down and say, what does this mean? And what are the consequences of all these things? And that's why I'm so thrilled once again to be talking to you, Heather. Let me ask you about this strange press conference that happened in the Oval Office. I've covered politics for a long time. I've never seen anything quite like it, where Elon Musk and his son and Donald Trump were talking to reporters. First of all, what was your reaction to the whole kind of bizarre scene?
It's funny you use that word because that was the word I used as well. It was bizarre. In terms of setting the scene, that's something that Donald Trump has always done extraordinarily well. And that's actually quite important for the rise of an authoritarian. And you've been able to see this in his first administration, through his campaign in 2024, and now in the present. The use of grand symbols, the backgrounds of flags, big columns, the ideas that there's this grandeur and this inevitability behind this presidency. So first of all, it was really shocking to see him sort of in the side behind the Resolute desk, quiet, while Elon Musk, who was dressed in a t-shirt and a Make America Great Again hat, which by the way is almost certainly a violation of the Hatch Act, which is the thing that says that officials are not supposed to be using positions for political purposes. Not that anybody in the Trump administration appears ever to have cared about the Hatch Act, but other administrations always have. And he was standing there with his child. And again, they're children in the Oval Office. That happens. It's actually quite a good thing, but not in an official event in which the child appears sort of to be part of the scenario. And then those scenes where the child and Trump are staring at each other. The whole thing was, in a way, I thought, like a picture, an image of the denigration of the American government. Because remember, the Oval Office is the official workspace of the President of the United States of America. And yet the president was sitting there behind the Resolute desk, and that's important. And the whole scene was being taken by a man who was not elected. His appointment still seems pretty dodgy to me. And he was the one who was getting all the questions while the president was deferring to him. And the Resolute desk thing really jumps out to me because the whole idea behind the Resolute desk is there's a very long storied history to that desk. And it was ultimately a gift of Queen Victoria to Rutherford B. Hayes. I think it was 1880 off the top of my head. And it was supposed to symbolize international alliances and friendships. And to have that happen on that day, the day before the Trump administration was rejecting those alliances and friendships, was, I don't actually use photographs for the most part in my newsletter, but that one I'm going to see if I can get to use tonight because it was a real. It will be in multiple books going forward as a symbol of the fall, I think, of American significance globally.
And I'm sure President Trump doesn't know any of that, where the desk comes from, or the historical significance of the Oval Office. I think he sees it as some kind of stagecraft, I guess. And I couldn't figure out if the presence of that little boy was meant to soften Elon Musk's image and to make him look like a nice guy and a father. It was just strange. And it was using this kid as a prop, which I thought was bizarre, you know?
Well, the child is everywhere. Somebody pointed out to me, I did not notice this myself. Somebody pointed out to me that he is pretty much ubiquitous on Musk's shoulders. And the person who said that to me suggested it was out of concern, Musk's concern for his own safety. In any case, it is, I have absolutely no idea, of course, but in any case, it's just odd. The whole thing is really odd. But that being said, we're in a really odd moment. So you just said something about Trump not knowing about the Resolute desk, which is actually a really cool story. But Trump is not at the top of his game by any stretch of the imagination. And that seems to me to be an important piece of where we are right now, too. He is 78 years old. He has been mentally slipping for a long time. And there seem to be other interests that are using this presidency to put in place things that it doesn't seem to me historically have been very important to Donald Trump, like Project 2025. Um, so when we're trying to figure out what's happening here, it's not only that stuff is coming at us really quickly, but it's that a lot of the lines that we think we know and thought we knew are not actually the ones who are pulling the strings in this administration. And that speaks to something else in this moment, and that's that it's really important for people to understand not just what's happening in the last moment, but to understand what the government is supposed to do and what the United States of America is supposed to mean, because we're losing that, and we're losing it to the hands of people who, as you say, seem to look at the world more transactionally than on principle.
I keep wondering, Heather, when I hear about these various actions, I keep wondering to what end? It's one thing to remove these safeguards or to dismantle certain agencies or to remove certain watchdogs from these governmental positions. But I always think, why? Why are they doing that? And we'll talk about that some more. But first, I want to ask you about the AP reporters who were denied access to the Oval Office presser we've been talking about, and another event, because the news outlet has continued to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico and not the Gulf of America. What was your reaction to that?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think that's incredibly important. And that speaks again to the rise of authoritarians. Do you remember after Trump was inaugurated in 2017, how then Press Secretary Sean Spicer came out and insisted that Trump's inaugural crowds were bigger than anybody else's, including Barack Obama's? Do you
Yes,
remember
of
that?
course. Yes, over and over again.
It went on and on and on. And people were sort of laughing at him like, we're looking at the photographs, dude. This is not what happened. And that's actually really important, because if you, as a rising authoritarian, can force people to accept your vision of reality, at least to say they accept it, it does a number of important things. First of all, you are imposing your reality on over their eyes and ears and observations. You are saying what you said. Don't believe your lying eyes, believe what I tell you. And that, first of all, disorients people. But second of all, once people have started to buy into your version of reality, it becomes harder and harder to walk away from that, because they're already invested. They've already said, yeah, I'm going to let you get away with that. So the next time they can always say, wait a minute, you were on board over this thing. Why are you not on board
Mm.
on this thing? And the parallel that somebody has drawn is to, a mob, for example, or some kind of an illegal gang, where the first thing they ask you to do may not be that bad in your mind, but then they escalate it. And you can't get away from the escalation because you've already said yes to the first thing. That no matter how hard I try to get away, they pull me back in. And that has been really central to the way that theorists have talked about the way individuals adhere to an authoritarian, because they become psychologically committed to them. And that also becomes part of their identity, so that the worse that person behaves, the more tightly they cling to that rising authoritarian. And I always think about someone like a Bellatrix Lestrange in Harry Potter, who the worse Voldemort treats her family, the tighter she clings to him, because he has become so important to her. So that idea that reporters have to use the Gulf of America when it has been called the Gulf of Mexico since at least the 1550s is, I think, a way to say, you're in my reality now, and you have to bow to my reality. And it's a terribly slippery slope, because once you start to say, okay, I'll let you get away with that, it's harder the next time to say no. That's a really important line to hold.
And I can't understand, and maybe does the president of the United States have the power to basically rename things? I mean, you think of Mount McKinley, right? and how that was renamed. So some people might say, hey, that happened. So Donald Trump is doing this. But what's to keep him from changing the name of California, a state he's not particularly fond of, to another name? I mean, where does it stop? And what authority does he have without any kind of congressional approval? I have to go back and look at the whole Mount McKinley Denali thing because I don't even know the provenance of that change specifically. But can you speak to that, Heather?
I can't believe it. I actually do know about that change. But just so you know, I have to look these things up. It's not like I learned this in graduate school and remembered it.
Okay,
What,
good.
of course, is that William McKinley is assassinated in 1901. That itself is an interesting story, but he was not a popular president at all. And the mountain becomes known as Mount McKinley under Woodrow Wilson. I think it's 1917, but I could be wrong about that. It might be 1915. And so it has always been known as Denali. That's its indigenous name, and it had always been known as Denali. But from the mid 19 teens until Barack Obama, the mountain was known as Mount McKinley, and then of course it changes back under Barack Obama to Denali, and that's simply been its name. So the ability to change names is again the ability to declare that you own something, which is why it is so important. And one of the things that people talk about when they talk about history, why the history that we teach matters, because it says this country or this idea or this culture belongs to these people. And so the ability to come in and say, no, it's going to be Mount McKinley again is really speaking to Trump's real reverence right now for William McKinley, who was not one of our great presidents. And that itself is very interesting. But
But do you think it's also a slight to Barack Obama, wanting to undo anything he did?
to Barack Obama, but certainly to indigenous Americans who had named that mountain however long ago. And Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, came out and said, "What are you doing? Of course you can't change the name of Denali." So again, I think that's a way to say I get to decide what things are called because I am so important. It's a really interesting dynamic because, of course, people have to buy into that, and the places where he's making stands are not places that there's a lot of support for doing things like changing that name. So it's interesting that he's picked the places that he has to make that demand.
Let's talk about the fact that Donald Trump signed an executive order during that Oval Office press conference directing agency officials to draw up plans for, quote, large scale cuts to the federal workforce. And he further empowered Elon Musk and his Doge team to approve which career officials are hired in the future. So not only who gets fired, but who gets hired. Why, in your view, is this problematic?
Well, I think let's start by going back to where you were before. Why do you think he's doing this?
Why is he doing it? Because there's going to be a loyalty test and a test of fealty towards Donald Trump. And that's why they got rid of all the prosecutors and FBI agents who were involved in any kind of Trump investigation. It's retribution, plain and simple. And now they're going to stack all the agencies, and the employees are all going to have to, I think, sign some kind of weird loyalty oath. What do you think?
I agree with that, but that kind of begs the question, to what end? And what do you think they're up to?
I think they're setting a scene where Donald Trump has an unprecedented amount of power. It's a massive power grab with no accountability.
Yeah, and I would add that,
I
always
feel
follow.
like I'm doing an oral exam, Heather.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's
No,
just
that's okay. It's fun.
but that's just it. I mean, one of the things about our history and our government that we tend to forget is that, first of all, it's ours. And second of all, that this is not nuclear physics. We know how people behave and why they behave that way. Why does Donald Trump want this kind of power? Some people want power because they want to make the world a better place. Some people want power because, they want cultural cachet. Some people want power because they want money. And I'm a big believer in following the money. So we started in this, you said, why are they doing this? Why do we have Doge or what I call doggy doing this? And why is all this happening? There's a lot of money in the US government. And we are in a place around the globe where global alliances are in danger, in part by the overreach of, or at least what I would call overreach of authoritarians like Vladimir Putin, like Viktor Orban, to some degree like Xi Jinping of China. And I think Trump wants in on that. And I certainly think that Musk wants in on that. And in order to get that, you've got to tear apart our international alliances that say we won't go into other countries, that we won't take over smaller countries. And you have to get rid of the watchdogs who say, no, 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 you can't go in and take over this organization or that organization. You can't privatize the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. You get rid of all that stuff and you get rid of the expensive policies that take care of the American people, then a few people can go in and pick up the pieces and put the money and the power in their own pockets.
Explain, though, what you meant about disrupting sort of the international alliances that have existed for a long time and why these seem to be shifting and how.
So, if you think about the way that the United States has operated in our lifetimes, but even before that, right after World War II, there's a real problem because in the 20th century, there had been two world wars. And the First World War, especially, but certainly the second as well, came about because of alliances that had been formed in or around the time of war that made people come to support each other in times of war. And that led to millions of people dying, the devastation of entire societies. And it happened twice in one generation. So after that war, what countries who had fought among the Allies in World War II did was they began to create a world that was tied together by peacetime alliances. Not that we're going to run after each other and help each other just in war, but that we're going to have alliances in peacetime. We're going to find ways to work together through allegiances like the United Nations, which is literally made of the same countries plus four others that were the allies, signed the treaty to be allies together in World War II. We're going to create a place where countries that have issues with each other can come in and can work it out without having to go to war. And fundamental to that is going to be the idea that big countries are not going to take over smaller countries. You're not going to have, another case of an authoritarian like Adolf Hitler just saying, well, this country is mine and I'm going to take it over. We're going to get rid of that. Now, those alliances, which included things like the United Nations and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, have been instrumental in trying to make sure, not in just in trying to make sure, but in making sure that we did not have world wars. Because what NATO really does is it says all of us countries that are part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will come to the rescue of any of the others if anybody is attacked. And of course, the big dog in that fight was the United States. This has been under attack largely, again, by people like Vladimir Putin, who was trying to get away from the idea that he couldn't take over smaller countries. So the invasion first of Georgia and then of Ukraine in 2014, and then Ukraine again in 2022 was really a way to say, we don't care about your NATO and we don't care about your rules. We're going to take over Crimea and it's going to be ours. And later on, we're going to take some of these other oblasts in Ukraine. And the big thing about the Biden administration was it tried to reinforce those norms, but also expand them. And as you know, the Biden administration brought two more countries into NATO, but it also brought in the African Union into the G20, for example. It tried to include new voices in that web. I think of it as like a web that holds down the rocks on a hillside so it doesn't slide.
Mm-hmm.
Administration has abandoned that. And now Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth today said that the US is no longer going to be a guarantor of of other countries' security, and that Europe is on its own, and that it's walking away from that idea that, for example, smaller countries don't have to worry about larger countries because of these international agreements that'll make sure that big countries can't just take over smaller countries. That's a really big deal. That is a really big deal because what that says is that we're going to develop a multipolar world, which is what a number of theorists have called for, in which basically smaller countries have to, sorry, but suck up to bigger countries so that they have some protection. And that's been the world that Vladimir Putin wanted, that Xi Jinping thought that would be good for China, and now apparently that America thinks it's going to live with as well. That is the same kind of world we had before World War II. And the reason that people like me are so concerned about it is because it is a recipe for big conflicts among big powers. And it looks like that's the direction we're going to be going now.
But instead of a conflict with Russia, Donald Trump seems to be sucking up to Vladimir Putin. And today he said he had a lengthy and highly productive call with him that he characterized as the start of the negotiation to end the war in Ukraine. So this whole kind of shift is making for some strange bedfellows, are they not?
Well, you could call it strange bedfellows, or you could say that Vladimir Putin set out in the after 2014 at least, to get rid of NATO, to get rid of these international agreements that kept the world stable, so that he would have access to the places in the world that he wants in order to garner resources, not only places like Ukraine, but also African countries. And what we have seen today, a big day, what we've seen today is the United States saying, okay, if you want those things, you can have them. And we would like to get along with you enough that we're going to let you have whatever you want, presumably with the idea that we, the United States, will start to do the same thing in a different sphere. It's a different approach to foreign policy. It's one that I'm appalled by, but there are theorists, of course, who think it's the wave of the future. They tend to be theorists who are authoritarians.
But doesn't that go against this whole idea of America first and sort of Donald Trump's insistence that we not get involved in any more wars and get involved in international conflicts?
Well, that's the argument, that America first simply pulls us back to our borders, and, other countries can do whatever they want. Again, that didn't really work that well in the early 20th century. But I would suggest that, first of all, America first is really a vague concept, because it seemed to me that was a way to win election more than it was a series
It
of.
also has some pretty scary historical references too, doesn't it?
It does. America First was really from the 1920s. Again, the idea of America hunkering down so that people like Adolf Hitler could do whatever they wanted in their own countries. And that was, commensurate with the rise of the KKK in America and of the neo-Nazi movement in America, or the Nazi movement, not neo-Nazi at the time. But the piece here that's really important, I think, is the recognition that NATO, especially since it formed in 1947, was crucial to making sure that we would not have these major conflicts. And it looks like we're walking away from that. And in an era in which there's extraordinary competition for resources around the globe, in which there's extraordinary migration because of climate change, that migration is going to bring disease, simply by virtue of the way human beings and human populations work. The idea that we can all divide under authoritarian governments, which are not known for treating their people very well, strikes me as being profoundly dangerous. And, we started by talking about the things that have happened in the last week. And I thought the most bizarre thing that I had seen, and the most disturbing thing I had seen, was Musk and his son with Trump in the Oval Office. And by the end of today, I thought, how on earth am I going to be able to talk about that? Because, in fact, this new relationship with Russia strikes me as being even more important than that.
Yeah, let's talk about what Pete Hegseth said. about Ukraine today. He called their desire, or the country's desire, to recover all of the territory it's lost to Russia since 2014, in other words, Crimea, right, is an unrealistic objective. So, what message are we sending to Ukraine and to Russia for that matter?
Well, to Russia, we're saying take it. Take this, take anything you want, because we're saying that those international boundaries, the idea that big countries couldn't take over smaller countries, that we don't care about that anymore. Which is extraordinary. I have to say it's extraordinary. But what we're saying to Ukraine is we are no longer going to back you up. Now, just again, this is Ukraine's war. They're going to have trouble fighting it without significant American support. But the Biden administration did make sure that they were funded from the American side through 2025. And Europe has very much stepped up because they recognize that this is an assault on Europe, not just on Ukraine. So it's not like we get to dictate what the Ukrainians do. This is much more, for me anyway, about the concept of the way the globe is going to work going forward. And in a time when, again, aside from everything you and I are talking about, climate change is a real problem. The idea that we are going to hunker down and say, no, we're not going to be part of any international solutions from now on is really serves a very, very few people. And it doesn't serve, I think, the people of America, let alone the people of the globe.
Let's talk about the confirmation of Tulsi Gabbard, if we could. As you know, she was confirmed as Director of National Intelligence today, despite some of her controversial, I guess, friendships or the admiration she has for Vladimir Putin. Um, why is that so significant in your view?
Well, once again, Vladimir Putin, who is the head of Russia, has worked very hard to destabilize democracies, especially to destabilize the United States of America, recognizing that if he could destabilize the United States of America, he could destabilize the support of the Americans for Europe, and he could make sure that he no longer had to grapple with NATO, for example, or with the kinds of world that I just described. And we know, of course, that he interfered in the 2016 election to elect Donald Trump, and that he has continued to interfere in American elections, and that American propaganda is very closely tied, right-wing propaganda is very closely tied to Putin. I do know that according to Julia Davis, who studies Russia and Russian TV right now, they are absolutely rejoicing at both Tulsi Gabbard being at the head of Director of National Intelligence and at the other things we have talked about today coming out of the US government, saying basically their work is done, that they have managed to tear apart American democracy and to guarantee that America will no longer stand behind European democracies. There's something else for the American people, though, that's really important, and that's that when you think about American strength, our strength has always been our people. Our strength has always been in the military side of things, our global side of things, our soft power, which is, the ability to influence people through things like providing food aid and culture, and through our intelligence. American intelligence is the gold standard. And by putting Tulsi Gabbard at the head of as our Director of National Intelligence, especially at a time when other systems of our national intelligence have been compromised, and I don't just mean the secret documents that went down to Mar-a-Lago, but also the fact that the Department of Government Efficiency teams did, in fact, go into the U.S. aid classified computers. We don't know where that information has gone, and that makes us extraordinarily vulnerable in a way that we were not before Donald Trump got involved in national security. It also means going forward that other countries are going to be extraordinarily reluctant to share their intelligence with us. And things like the Five Eyes, which has been in place since World War II, has been extraordinarily important in protecting the United States of America. And we have just thrown that overboard.
What are the Five Eyes?
The Five Eyes are, I always laugh with a friend. We always have trouble getting all five of them. So if I get the wrong ones, I'm sorry to whichever country I leave out. They're the five English speaking countries, or organizations, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I did get them all five, and they share intelligence. So it came out of World War II because they were known as the Five Eyes because there were dispatches that only they could see, and they became known that way. And they are, well, we don't hear about it much in America, but a few years ago there was a huge bust across Europe of organized crime, and that was a joint organization, a joint effort between the Australians and the United States. And if you remember, one of the ways that it broke open that the Russians were working for Donald Trump in 2016 was that somebody had boasted to an Australian ambassador. And a lot of people thought, why are the Australian ambassadors worried about America? Because of Five Eyes. Now, Five Eyes is just not going to care anymore. Not that they're not going to care, but they're going to be much more reluctant to share stuff with us.
What are some of the other ramifications of her confirmation in your view?
Well, that's a big one. I mean, what we're seeing is the sharing, I think, or the compromising of our national intelligence, which I say is our gold star around the world. And what that means is that people are going to be less willing to work with us. And by people, I don't just mean other countries, I mean operatives who no longer know that they're safe. I mean, if you think about what they may or may not have seen at USAID, we don't know what's in those files. And if you are somebody who's working in a country against someone or for someone, you need that to be kept secret. And now it's not. I mean, if it were you, would you be willing to say, "Oh yeah, I'll work against Vladimir Putin, for example, for the Americans in a country in Africa?" The answer is no, because you have no idea that you're going to stay secure.
This is not so much because of Tulsi Gabbard, but it's because of compromised intelligence, primarily by Elon Musk and his merry band of dogers, if you will.
In that case, yes, but the concern about Tulsi Gabbard was the company that she was keeping. She has spoken in language that reflects that of Vladimir Putin's propaganda. And she was close to the head of Syria, who was, of course, propped up by Russia and took refuge in Russia after his people threw him out.
Heather, we're hearing the phrase constitutional crisis often in recent days, but it begs the question, what is the definition of a constitutional crisis?
A constitutional crisis is when the United States Constitution, which is the framework for our government, it's a government of laws, not of men, as the framers said, when that Constitution is not being followed. And we are in one. It's not a budding one. It's not coming. We are in one. And we are in one for this very simple reason. The Constitution sets up three branches of government, and they're supposed to be equal. Sometimes we talk about Congress as being first among equals because it is the first section of the three that set out those three branches of government. And what the Constitution says is that, I mean, if you think about the Constitution, all it is a blueprint for how people have the right to have a say in their government, because that's why this country was so revolutionary, that it said that ordinary people got to choose their governments. They didn't have to live under kings. But how do you do that? So they created this framework, and what it says is the way people make laws is they elect representatives. And they elect representatives who meet in two chambers. Those chambers are the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the House of Representatives turns over every 2 years so that it can be very close to the people. The Senate turns over 1/3 every 2 years. So it can turn over in its entirety every 6 years, although it rarely does. It's a very long, it has very long, people have very long terms or people in the Senate tend to stay there a long time. Years ago, the only house that turned over less frequently than the US Senate was the House of Lords. But the way the Congress works is that only the House of Representatives can start revenue bills. But either house, other than that, can create a bill, can argue the bill, can pass the bill, and then the other house has to pass it. They are the only lawmaking body in our government. Then If they have passed a measure, it goes to the president, and the president can either sign it and make it a law, or veto it and send it back to Congress for them to rewrite it or to ignore it, which they almost never do. So that's how we get laws in the United States of America. And then after 1803's Marbury v. Madison decision of the Supreme Court and the federal courts took on the role of deciding whether or not a law was constitutional. That's not in the Constitution itself. They took that on in 1803, and we've lived with that since 1803. But what we have now, and we had as soon as Donald Trump came into office, was his people unilaterally decided that they were not going to honor the laws that Congress passed. They were going to say, we're not going to fund these laws. We are now, even though they're all laws and a president signed them, are going to decide whether or not we're going to fund them. And that's A, unconstitutional, and B, was written by the Congress specifically as being against the law in 1974 after Richard Nixon tried to do it. So this is why you've seen all these courts saying you can't do this. This is blatantly unconstitutional. You cannot stop funding the National Institutes of Health. You cannot stop funding all these laws that passed Congress and that presidents signed. That is unconstitutional. Now, of course, what we're seeing is certain members of the administration indicating that they don't want to honor those judicial opinions, which even Josh Hawley has come out, who's a Republican senator, has come out and said, you can't just disregard the courts. But this idea that the president can unilaterally decide to appoint people who say we're not going to honor certain laws destroys the very concept of the idea that Americans get to vote for people to make their own laws, and it turns Congress into what is essentially an advisory body that has no force, which is beyond even the ability to grapple with in our history, because it completely overturns the idea that we get to write our own laws.
To say this is an executive branch power grab really is an understatement. But I've read that Project 2025, part of the goal is to test this 1974 impoundment law, which I don't really understand, but basically saying the executive branch does have the ability to override Congress to determine what gets funded, who gets hired, who gets fired, et cetera, et cetera. But you believe that that is a law that was designed for a reason.
Well, it's not just me that believes it. Every court has supported this position. This is not some he said, she said thing. Impoundment is simple. And you can tell it, you can see exactly what's going on here. Like I say, this stuff is not really that hard. They use big words, and I don't really know why, because you don't need them. What happened was that Richard Nixon didn't like some of the stuff that Congress did. So even though he signed laws, Congress passed a law and he signed the law, he would say, well, I like the law, but I didn't really like this piece of it. So I'm just not going to let go of the money that Congress put behind this particular piece of the law, so that even though it's the law, it can't actually really be the law because there's no money to do it. And that was called impoundment. And you saw Trump try this in 2019 when he refused to disperse the money that Congress had appropriated for Ukraine to fight back against Russia's 2014 invasion, until Volodymyr Zelensky, who was the leader of, and still is the leader of Ukraine, essentially smeared Joe Biden. And the reason that was such a big deal is because he was explicitly impounding and then trying to get a quid pro quo out of Zelensky for the release of those monies. But the reason that is courts have said all along, you can't do that, is because, again, it is foundational to our government that Congress makes our laws and that the president swears faithfully to execute them. That is in the Constitution. He doesn't get to say, no, I don't like that. I don't like that piece. I want this. He can make suggestions to Congress for laws to pass, but he can't write those laws. So this is the moment of crisis that we're in, that and the attack on the judiciary. And one of the things that seems to me very obvious is one of the reasons they're doing this is in fact that Project 2025, especially the new director of the Office of Management and Budget, whose last name is Vogt, has been talking about is getting rid of anything but this extraordinarily strong executive. They want to create a strong man in his case because he wants a theocracy in America. In Musk's case, I think he is more interested in tearing apart the U.S. government so that he can have access to those funds so that he can get to Mars. That's his big thing. I can't believe I'm even saying that. Um,
I want to ask you about all those things, and I want to focus on the judiciary branch in a moment. But before we move on, this idea of a constitutional crisis, has this ever happened before?
no. No, I mean, the whole idea, again, if you think about the simple thing of it, this is not like, and one of the things I confess it frustrates me is this is not like, well, I'm disagreeing with you about this amendment, or we should have put this bill out 2 days before. I mean, this is not minutia. This is the concept of human self-determination. And the reason that the Constitution is written the way it was is because the framers of that Constitution had just lived through a revolution against a monarch. And what they really wanted to do was guarantee that the American people would never have to live under a king. And in fact, the powers that Trump is claiming right now are bigger than those that any king had that they rebelled against because the king did have to work with Parliament. And they created this system to guarantee that we would not have to kowtow to an authoritarian. And getting rid of inspectors, getting rid of Congress's very right to make our laws creates an authoritarian. And doing so under this guise of cleaning up fraud is really frustrating when you remember, of course, that the government has the Government Accountability Office, and which is the GAO. I think I got the name of that right, but it's a
Yeah,
GAO,
that's right.
which is the inspector for the U.S. government.
Right, and not to mention, Heather, the individual agencies have inspectors general to monitor corruption and fraud and waste in all of these agencies. And he firing them was one of the first things he did.
Right. 18 of them. Yeah.
You know, the Wall Street Journal's editorial board published an op-ed this week. They made the argument that, quote, Trump's actions are aggressive, but they are not an executive coup. They also make the argument that Trump isn't the first president stretching laws to see what he can get away with. I'd love to hear your take on that. They mentioned Barack Obama sort of did similar things. They say Joe Biden exceeded his power by canceling student loans, mandating vaccines, and banning evictions. So I'm curious if you can compare these actions and what you think of this Wall Street Journal editorial.
Well, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, of course, leans quite hard right, and they have also been criticizing this current Trump administration. But I would agree that presidents do all try to expand their power. They do always try to push the envelope, but they also are prepared to listen to the courts when the courts say you can't do something. And in this case, we have an administration that not is just simply pushing the envelope. And one of the things that you keep hearing about is how Biden tried to end student loan debt and then went ahead and did it after the court slapped him down. Well, he actually did something very different after the court slapped him down and actually simply used the laws that were already in place. Those were not challenged by the courts. So presidents try and expand their power, but they don't deliberately break a law, and they don't say then if the courts slap them down, I'm not going to do it anyway. The one time you've seen that before was, of course, Andrew Jackson, who said to the Supreme Court that he would not honor their decision that he could not force the Cherokees and certain other indigenous tribes out of the American East forcing them west to Oklahoma. Although even then, he did try and get treaties in order to make that happen. But the converse of that I think really stands out in this moment was when Dwight Eisenhower, Republican, stood behind the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 and enforced it with the troops in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, because he said we must enforce the judiciary or we will lose our Constitution.
Let's talk about what is going on in the courts. More than 50 lawsuits have been filed against Trump's executive orders, and state courts are stepping in as well. Can you give us a brief description? I don't know how you remember everything, Heather, what's going on in the courts right now and how they're trying to stop certain actions taken by the administration?
So, really, at the heart of most of the cases, the court cases, and just as a warning here, I am not a lawyer, is this attempt of the Office of Management and Budget by Russell, who's Russell Vogt from Project 2025. I'm sorry, he was an author of Project 2025. He actually has worked before, both in the Trump administration, and he worked for the Freedom Caucus in the right-wing House Freedom Caucus. The freezing of the monies that went behind U.S. aid and any in the Inflation Reduction Act, and basically they came into office and they froze domestic spending and most other non-military spending, most other foreign aid. They didn't stop military aid to Israel or military aid to Egypt, but they stopped everything else. And again, they don't have the power to do that because Congress famously has the power of the purse. The
Right.
Congress gets to run things because it has the power of the purse. By taking that power of the purse, they have taken that away. So there are all these lawsuits challenging that. There are also lawsuits challenging the firings that have happened without Trump going through the statutory, that is the legal method for doing that. So in 2022, after Trump fired inspectors general in his first term, 2022, so that's recent, Congress passed a law saying that if you're going to try and fire an inspector general, you have to give Congress 30 days notice and the reason for that firing. And Trump simply didn't. He told them all not to come to work. Similarly, there have been all these firings. So basically what you're seeing are people saying, you can't do these things because of these particular laws. And so far, they've won on every single one of them.
And do you think that the Trump administration will respect what the courts say, or will they ignore the courts? And if they do, many people on social media are asking, what recourse do we have?
So two things. I don't predict the future. I can predict the past. I can't predict the future. But I would like to point out something that is going to happen, and I think that this is very much part of the plan, that even if they lose in court, they will have so changed events on the ground that in a way those changes are moot. So, for example, by destroying US aid, even if a court in a month, 2 months says you can't do that, they've already recalled all the US aid officers. They've already destroyed all those programs. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is, as you identified before, when you put in place all these loyalists in place of the people that they have gotten rid of, you've changed things on the ground enough that it doesn't really matter what the courts do in the end, which is one of the reasons that it's so important for people to be recognizing what's happening now and speaking up now. What recourse we have, I think, is also very important. And that's twofold. One is it's so important to remember that Constitution starts we the people, because the people in our government have no power unless we grant it to them. And American governments do not have legitimacy unless they have the people behind them. So other countries, a king can have legitimacy because of the people from whom he's descended, or an authoritarian leader can have legitimacy because of his religion. Or, there's all these different ways in which people have legitimacy when they govern. In the United States of America, people do not have legitimacy unless we, the people, stand behind them. And that's going to be really important now and for the next couple of weeks, as we're seeing these cuts to the programs that the Trump administration has made have been devastating for America's farmers. They have been devastating for America's rural communities that voted heavily for Trump. The cuts to the Department of Education hit Republican dominated states more powerfully than Democratic dominated states. The cuts to the National Institutes of Health, same thing. It's really medical centers and colleges in Republican dominated states that are real engines of the economy. So the thing that people need to be aware of and be doing in the short term is keep those calls coming, keep pressure coming on not only your national leaders, but your state leaders and even your local leaders to say, we do not support this and we do not support what is happening to this country. Because people didn't believe that they were voting for the destruction of the American state that we've had since the 1930s. They thought they were voting for the car to get a checkup, not for it to be dismantled and sold for parts. And they need to speak up about that.
Well, I think what's interesting is many Republican lawmakers in Washington seem to be less afraid of we the people than they are of Donald Trump and his ability to primary them, or Elon Musk's ability to funnel huge amounts of money to people who may oppose them. So, when do you think that connection will be made, Heather, that this is actually hurting some of the very people who voted for not only Donald Trump, but these Republican lawmakers who are so loyal to him and refuse to stand on principle to say, wait a second, this isn't constitutional. We're not going to allow this to happen.
Well, it actually is starting to make the news. So the Bulwark had a piece out, I think it was yesterday, in which they pointed out how when people began to complain to their Republican lawmakers about what was happening, they initially were dismissed or got form letters back that said, that's not really what's happening. And those letters have increasingly said, well, actually, we're going to oversee this. Congress is going to oversee this. The Department of Government Efficiency is only advisory, although, of course, the executive order of yesterday made it far more than advisory. It's now involved in every agency in the US government. So that pressure is making a difference. One of the things about doing history and about, this will come as no surprise to you, is that stuff changes all the time. It's changing on the ground all the time. And we are 3 weeks into this administration. The real pain has not begun for people who are now facing, for example, 25% tariffs on aluminum, which is going to badly hurt the car industry. It hasn't really hit yet, although it's certainly, we're hearing about it, that USAID spent more than $20 billion buying agricultural products from US farmers. It hasn't really hit that if in fact they make the cuts they're talking about to Medicaid, that's badly going to hurt, especially rural healthcare centers. So as those things get more and more obvious to people, there's going to be more and more pain, and Republicans are going to hear more and more about it. I do think push has got to come to shove, or we're going to end up with a country with an authoritarian who doesn't have to pay attention to what people care about. Now is the time for us to make sure that that power that's sloshing around in Washington right now doesn't ultimately land, and it's not going to land on Trump. You could see from our discussion of that photograph of the Oval Office that it's not Trump who's going to walk away with the power to run America. It's going to be Elon Musk or somebody like him who's going to take all that power. And I don't think that's what Americans really wanted or voted for when they voted for Donald Trump in November.
How can Elon Musk have all this unprecedented power, Heather, when he has not been appointed? He wasn't confirmed by Congress. So many people can't understand how, also, P.S., with so many conflicts of interest, how he is being put in this position and how he's able to do all the things he's doing.
So theoretically, I mean, there is a theory behind this. This is extra constitutional. This is let's ignore the Constitution and just do whatever we want. Just act like we can do whatever we want, because then it's much harder for the Constitution to catch up with us. But let's talk practicality. He can do this because Republicans in the Senate are not saying he can't. It's important to remember that the Republican senators could have stopped any of the things that Donald Trump has done since 2015 if they wanted to, and they are choosing not to do that. So the remedy for what's happening right now is in the Constitution as well. It's that the House of Representatives should impeach somebody who has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and that doesn't even have to be a broken law. That could simply be a president who watches TV all day because they're not doing their job. But the idea is that the House of Representatives should impeach someone like that, and the Senate should try them and convict them. That's not happening, and it's likely not going to happen with these Republicans in Congress. But that's the obvious answer for what's happening here. In the even less extreme side of that, the Republican senators could do a number of things to stop him from behaving the way he is acting. They could say, we're not going to pass your budget. They could say, we're not going to pass your tax cuts. They could say, we're not going to confirm your nominations. And they're refusing to do that. So this is, again, at the end of the day, the only people who can save the American government and the American Constitution and way of life are the American people.
It's unbelievable to me that Republicans are refusing to step up and say, you can't do this. Have you ever witnessed anything or know anything in history where this has happened before, that they've just rolled over for a president?
So, no, but it has come to seem to me that what really happened was since the 1980s, the Republican Party began to honor the party over the country in a way that they didn't, certainly under Richard Nixon when he resigned, because Republican senators led by Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who was
And Howard Baker, right?
told him that they were going to convict him. And they have come to believe that they are the only people who have the right to govern. And of course, this is, again, a stepstone to authoritarianism. It seems to me, first of all, profoundly sad, because this is a great country. And giving it away to any one person, but certainly to somebody who could not be president himself because he is not a natural born American, and to somebody who clearly has only his own interests in mind, first of all, is very sad. But it's also astonishing to me because anybody who studies authoritarians will tell you that nobody is safe, and that the people who were the stepping stones for that authoritarian to rise might not be the first people who lose their positions and their wealth and sometimes their lives, but they're not the last people either. The way to stop an authoritarian is to stand up to them. And you can see this with Donald Trump and the way that Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico, the leader of Mexico, had basically just threw everything in his face. And now he's not picking on Mexico any longer. She really gave them an example of the way you stand up to Trump. And you've seen this. Anybody who stands up to him, he turns and picks on someone else. So the idea that somehow they're going to avoid this and stay senators is, uh, you know, quisling thinking at its very best. And I think Angus King of Maine tried to call that out during the call to confirm Russell vote, in which he said to them, "Are there no red lines?" And, I'd read an interview with him where apparently they said to him, well, Biden did stuff we didn't like too. And he just shook his head and said, there are no red lines, apparently.
You've written extensively about the fragility of democracy, and one of my followers wrote, is our democracy so fragile that it can be destroyed and dismantled so easily and swiftly? What do these first few weeks of Trump's second term tell us about where we stand as a country?
I don't think that Trump is acting just on his own, just in these last 3 weeks. This crisis has been coming for 40 years. It's come, as I say, from the Republican Party putting party above country. It's come from voter suppression. It's come from gerrymandering. It's come from stacking the Supreme Courts with radicals. This is not just the last 3 weeks. Democracies are incredibly fragile, but they can also be incredibly robust. It takes about 3% of the people to really make a difference if they're speaking up about the things they care about. We can do that in America, and we could rebuild this country as it has needed to be rebuilt for a while now, along much healthier lines than it has been in the lifetimes pretty much of anybody who's under 50 years old. So it's very fragile. It's not over yet. This game has not played itself out. There is still time to rebuild America and to rebuild it in healthy ways. But enough Americans have to understand that that line that they have been fed for 40 years, that anytime the government helps anyone, it's essentially redistributing wealth downward from white people to Black, undeserving, people of color, whatever the description of those others were, was always a myth. The government working for all of us was always what was at stake. And what we're seeing now is the dismantling of that government and it really hurting the people who voted for Donald Trump. So if they will pay attention and recognize that the government that serves all of us is the one that's best for everyone, then we can rebuild. If they don't, and if people continue to support Trump's attack on the Constitution itself and his willingness to turn the country over to Trump, America's best days are behind us, but I think we're writing its end days as well, which is profoundly sad. But I'm not ready to give up on it yet.
You have said we're seeing the collapse of American democracy because of the lies we began to embrace in the 1950s. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, although the lies that we embraced in the 1950s were also part of our earlier history, primarily Reconstruction, and that came from an earlier time as well. And that was that after World War II, really beginning in the 1930s, but taking off during the war and in the immediate aftermath of it, we had presidents of both parties, begun by Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and expanded by Democratic President Harry Truman, but then really built upon by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower. The idea that the government had a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, that's Social Security, for example, promoting infrastructure, the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, for example, and protecting civil rights, that is, guaranteeing that all Americans had a right to be treated equally before the law, the way the Declaration of Independence nods. And Americans of both parties believed in that, but a number of people who either didn't want at the time Black and brown Americans to have rights, joined with people who didn't want business regulation or the basic social safety net that cost taxes, to say that that government that was so wildly popular was in fact simply redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to undeserving Black Americans primarily, but also people of color and later women who wanted to work outside the home. That was always a myth. It was always a lie. But they tied it to the image of the American cowboy, the idea that a real American was one who wanted nothing but to be left alone, to work hard and rise and take care of his family. It was always a white man in that formula in the 1950s, although in reality, about a third of cowboys were people of color. That image came right from Reconstruction, that idea of the cowboy being the true American hero. But you know, the reality of the American West was never the cowboy. The cowboy was a part of our history for sure, but the myth of the cowboy made him far more important than he was. The cowboy always worked for a capitalist who had all the money and the power and didn't have that powerful or that romantic a life. The people who built the American West were always communities. They were always people who had kinship ties. They were always people who were willing to work together for a barn raising, for example. And that idea of community was really always what was at the heart of true America. And that's the idea that made America able to work together to win World War II, for example, with our allies, or to be able to accomplish some of the extraordinary things this country has done. And the denigration of that idea was really what managed to tear apart that post-war agreement among parties and among people of all parties that we wanted to work together to build a country. We're seeing that now. We're literally seeing the dismantling of that idea and the idea that individuals should be utterly on their own and the idea that individuals should be utterly on their own without the help of government, and that a few rich people should be able to walk away with the great wealth and power of the United States. And that, I think, has not served us well at all. And we need to reclaim the older and more organic idea of what made America great.
It makes me want to reread The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, right? Because it seems eerily reminiscent of that kind of rugged individualism, right?
Exactly. And of course, we know that Ayn Rand actually lived on public assistance when she wrote. It was always a myth. That's just not the way the world works. It's never been the way the world works. And who would want it to work that way?
Do you think that the average American realizes or appreciates what is at stake here, if there is an average American?
That's a really good question. Um, I'm not sure they articulate it that way. I think perhaps Americans are unaware of how fragile our democracy can be because most of us alive, the vast majority of us alive now, don't really remember a world in which we didn't have the sort of government that did, in fact, do things like invest in cancer research, did, in fact, support education, did in fact, work on our infrastructure, our supply chains, did try and encourage the American economy. So I don't think they recognize that it could go away. And I think you see this with the farmers who are horrified now to recognize that USAID will not be buying $2 billion worth of their products. So I think that that is starting to dawn on a lot of people that there was more at stake than they thought. But I'm not sure people are aware of why the concept of American democracy remains so incredibly important. I think globally, but certainly here at home, because the idea that we have inherited this extraordinary inheritance of almost 250 years of a country that says we have a right to be treated equally before the law, we have a right to have a say in our government, and we have a right to have equal access to resources, including jobs and education, is really about human destiny and the idea that we are part of this inheritance of a form of government that was designed to guarantee that we could create our own futures. We don't talk about that in lofty terms in America a lot these days because I think people thought it was just our birthright and we didn't have to talk about it. But people all around the world are fighting for that. They're fighting for the right even to do things like drive a car if you're a woman. So the idea that we might be just throwing that overboard and rowing away from it strikes me as something that people ought to be paying attention to because it sounds grandiose and we put it together in daily practical ways, getting a job, getting to worship wherever you want, getting to say you don't like your government. But over all that, there is something really quite profound. And we are so incredibly lucky in this country to have inherited it that the idea that people are willing to walk away from it, I don't think they really are if they think about it, because this is what their fathers fought for at D-Day. This is what we fought for in the Civil War. There's a heritage here that I think people care about when they understand that this is really what's at stake.
That was so beautiful and profound. And God, I could talk to you for hours. I know we have to wrap. Can I ask you a couple quick questions from social? I'm probably exhausting you. Can you explain the SAVE Act and its effect on the right to vote, especially among married women? I've been seeing a lot of this on social media.
Right. So the SAVE Act is a law in search of a problem because it purports to solve the crisis of non-citizens voting. And non-citizens voting is already against the law. It is designed to stop what Republicans say is the problem of voter fraud. Voter fraud is extraordinarily rare in the United States. It's really not a problem. But there is something that is like voter fraud that we do have a problem with, and that's election fraud. Election fraud is when you alter the system in such a way that you can win an election because you have, for example, gotten rid of a lot of the people who otherwise would vote. And that's really what's going on with the SAVE Act, because by requiring documentation in person of your citizenship when you vote. First of all, that knocks, I think it's about 140 million people don't have, for example, a passport, which is one of the ways you could document that you're a citizen. But it also provides a real problem. It also presents a real problem for American women, because those women who have birth certificates, many women change their names when they get married. And so their birth certificates do not match their adult names. And that, I think, is about 69 million women. Those numbers are off the top of my head. And that's a real attempt to get women away from voting, because women overwhelmingly support the Democrats. And people like Peter Thiel have said that really we shouldn't have women voting because they tend to vote for Democrats.
It's absurd. How can they pass this? Hasn't it passed the House?
It has passed the House at least in one incarnation. I actually looked at the numbers last night, and I don't remember where it stands now. It has not passed the Senate yet, but how you can do it is that there are ways to convince voters of voting for things that sound good, but they're not really good. And this is a long tradition in America. But in this case, it's important to remember that voter fraud is actually extraordinarily rare. And the idea that we have to do things to stop non-citizens from voting, that virtually never happens. You're more likely to get hit by lightning twice than have that happen. But it's also important to remember that election fraud, skewing the vote in such a way that people who would vote against you cannot vote, that's actually quite common in the United States. And that's something that we have seen in the modern era, really since 1986, when the Republicans started to do it. And then especially after the 1993 passage of the so-called Motor Voter Act, when after that attempt of the Democrats to make it easier to vote, Republicans began to say that when Democrats won elections, they had done so only through fraud. And that's where you get that concept really rising of voter fraud, although it's really never been a thing, I promise you.
And it didn't affect the 2020 outcome, much to Donald Trump's dismay in private, probably, although he keeps insisting he never lost, which, by the way, makes me want to rewatch a documentary about Roy Cohn, because he was so influential in Donald Trump's early life and really gave him some of the behavioral traits that I think he's using to never admit defeat, etc. Can I do one?
But to go back on it for a second on that, this actually is a real issue, and it bothers me that since 2021, for example, 34 states cut back on voting rights. And we look at 2024 and people say, well, why didn't Black people show up for 2024? And they don't put that together with the fact that we have had these voter suppression laws. And these have been going into play in America, as I say, since 1986, but they really dramatically take off in 1998, when Florida throws about 100,000 people off the voting rolls right before the 2000 election. Well, how many votes did the 2000 election come down to? And people point to the butterfly ballot in Florida, which did, in fact, siphon off a lot of votes from Al Gore to a right-wing candidate. But 100,000 people were dropped off the rolls in 1998, right before the 2000 election. And that has been multiplying ever since then. And that's one of the things that the American people are going to have to grapple with, because we're getting rid of the idea of free and fair elections. People simply find they are unable to vote. Their votes get discounted. Their votes get challenged for one thing or another. Right now, in North Carolina, there's a candidate who lost the vote and is currently trying to throw 60,000 votes out. So he will be, he assumes, named the victor of that race.
Final question, and I hope you'll come back and we can do it again, Heather. But
Always, Katie.
someone asks, what can I do? Is there anything that I, as a citizen with little to no discretionary funds, do to help save our country? I feel helpless, but trying to ride this tsunami of chaos to the best of my ability. I think that comment echoes what so many Americans are feeling right now, Heather. They feel helpless. Yes, they're calling their members of Congress. Maybe they're writing them as well, but they feel like, what else can we do?
You are not helpless. This is our country. So continue to call at all levels of the government, but also get involved. Get involved at the local level. You can get involved at the national level through all the many good organizations that are doing pro-democracy work. Make sure you're not doing it alone, because being isolated makes you feel like you're helpless, but turn that frustration and anger toward accomplishing something to support democracy and to support the different organizations and the different causes in America you care about. But now here's my piece of this. Those things everybody will tell you. I'm going to go back to Katie, you and me talking about Trump trying to turn the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. The way we talk about things matters. Like we were just talking about, do people understand what's at stake? Speak up, use your voice on social media, which is, of course, where so much poison gets spread. When somebody says something that's not true, push back, say, no, that's not true. Talk about the things you care about. Talk about the United States and why it matters to you. Talk about the pieces of government that you think matter that are being cut and why they matter. Use personal stories, because the more that people understand what's at stake, the more people understand what it means to cut these pieces of government that matter so much to so many people, the more they understand exactly who is going to lose out and what that means to their neighbors, the more they will understand that this is not just somebody being mean to Donald Trump. This is the destruction of our land, of our country. And they too will start to push back. And that's how you change the ship of state.
Heather Cox Richardson, you're the greatest. Thank you so much, Heather.
It's always a pleasure, Katie.